Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, using the upper planes in our stories, the final part. In the wilds, the hollyphant. And in the tavern, what would you do if the gods were at war? Why, hey there, everybody. Hope everyone out there is having an excellent day. Excited to close out our series about using the upper planes in our stories today by looking at Arborea and the Beastlands. Before we get into the Prime Material, though, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Of course, remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, if that would be your preferred way of listening to the podcast. And we would appreciate it, however you listen, if you give the podcast a rating. It helps more people find the show. And it would be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there as we've been tinkering with the Patreon and adding new features, such as the Sunday Magic item, which gets released to our upper tiers. Your support is genuinely appreciated. It helps offset the cost of running the podcast. But regardless of how you listen and how you interact with us, we genuinely appreciate each and every one of you out there, and we are so glad that you're a part of the Plot Hooks family. We also have a lot of things upcoming in August. One, we're going to launch our quest for 1K, our quest for 1,000 followers on Twitter. We are partnering with various creators such as Arcane Spectacles, Greenleaf Geek, and Games by B. We're going to be doing lots of stuff with those creators and others in order to provide some excellent giveaways for y'all as we quest for that 4-digit mark. We also have the launch of Plot Hooks Adventures, the new show that brings together content creators in the TTRPG space, as well as members of the Plot Hooks team and our patrons to do one-shots set in our world of Carrick. If you're interested in being a part of that and appearing on an episode, well, that's one of the perks that you get on one of our tiers on Patreon. I should have an official launch date for you for both of those projects, which are going to launch simultaneously next week on the podcast. Well, without further ado, the final part of using the upper planes in our stories. This is, of course, the fourth part in this series, so if you're interested in hearing the previous discussions, Part 1 was Episode 2, Part 2 was Episode 17, and Part 3 was Episode 22. The concept that we've been exploring is that as DMs and as players, if you're trying to build a backstory that involves these particular places, it's rather simple to use the lower planes in D&D's cosmology in a story, like the Nine Hells or Gehenna or the Abyss, because they're the inherently evil planes. And it's quite easy to have a quest to slay a nefarious creature here, or have a villain residing here, or have some sort of negative influence coming from one of these places. But what we're looking at in this series is what kind of story elements we can weave into our collaborative narratives for the upper planes, those good aligned planes in the multiverse. In Part 1, we discussed this concept in a general sense, and then looked specifically at Elysium and Bitopia. In Part 2, we looked at Arcadia and Eastgard, and in Part 3, we covered Mount Celestia and its 7 layers. And today, we're going to finish out the series by looking at the last 2 planes, the Beastlands and Arborea. We've reviewed briefly the D&D multiverse and what's meant by the D&D cosmological terms in the first 2 of these episodes, so I won't do it again here, but just by way of quick reminder, when I say the word outer planes, I'm talking about those planes far from the prime material that are situated along the D&D alignment chart. There's 16 of them, each corresponding to a specific alignment or combination of alignments. And that plane itself, each one of those 16, is defined by that alignment. And those philosophies are knitted into the fabric of what makes that plane work. And the outer planes that are aligned in some way with evil are called the lower planes, and those that are aligned in some way with good are the upper planes. And today, we have the Beastlands, which is aligned at the border between neutral good and chaotic good, and Arborea, which is the chaotic good aligned plane. So first, let's discuss the Wilderness of the Beastlands, to give it its full name. And this is a wild place, a place where nature holds complete sway. There's heavy forests and thick jungles and rolling plains and everything in between as nature just exists and thrives. Anything that grows can find a place to thrive here, whether it's in a more arid desert-type region on the plain or in a cool snowy forest area. There's every type of place for any kind of flora to thrive. The Dungeon Master's Guide uses the phrase, "The plain embodies nature's wildness and beauty." But it's not just flora, it's also fauna. It's wildlife. All manner of beasts call this place home, even magical ones. Here, the most loyal animal companions find their rest when they die. And in fact, depending on your cosmology, some believe that the spirits of all wild animals find their way to the Beastlands. And many of these denizens who dwell here are of the celestial variety, like their prime material counterparts in most regards, but their intelligence is slightly higher and they gain the ability to speak celestial. They're still clearly animals. Their instincts aren't dulled at all. It wouldn't be nature's paradise if nature wasn't allowed to be nature. So they're still predators and prey, still the hunter and the hunted. But you have these more intelligent aspects of these particular celestial animals. And there's, of course, normal animals as well. This place is just pure nature embodied. As such, not very many humanoids find themselves here, unlike most of the other outer planes. Not many individuals go here for their afterlife. There's not a lot of deities that dwell here for worshippers to come to their specific godly realm whenever they die, if that is how the afterlife works in your setting. There are a couple, such as the centaur and satyr deity Scarret, but there's not a lot here compared to most of the other outer planes. Some humanoids do get here whenever they pass away, though. Some could be individuals whose philosophy aligned with the plane, perhaps a druid or some other individual with a heavy nature connection. There are, of course, the worshippers of the deities that do dwell here. There's also good-aligned lycanthropes who, while they lose their lycanthropy on this plane, they can come here after death and enjoy being amidst their animal kin. As far as people who aren't here as an afterlife, because of course the outer planes also have a lot of just regular living denizens as part of them as well, there's not a lot of them here. It is nature embodied after all. There are some travelers that pass through, some who come here as hunters trying to track a magical beast, or nature-based sages seeking to gain knowledge and guidance, but there's not a lot of civilization here. According to the past lore, and some of this information that I'm stating is coming from the Manual of the Planes back in 3.5, some of this information hasn't been fully fleshed out and canonized for D&D 5th edition yet. And one of the things which D&D 5th edition hasn't touched on is the multiple layers of several of the planes. There's lots of planes such as Mount Celestia, which has classically 7 layers, or the 9 hells, or the infinite layers of the abyss. And those particular places make sense to have multiple layers. But in old lore, literally every plane had multiple layers in some way, shape, or form. And the Beastlands is no different. It has 3. And we've discussed in the past my feelings on this. I think that it's completely unnecessary unless it's something that is built into what makes the plane what it is, like the 7 layers of Mount Celestia. I think that you can just as easily have the different layers of places like the Beastlands just be different aspects of the infinite plane. It is infinite after all. But nonetheless, old lore has the Beastland with 3 layers. The top layer is Krigala, which is a realm of eternal afternoon. The second layer is Brooks, which is a realm of eternal twilight. And the final layer, Karasuthra, unsurprisingly, is eternal night, filled with moonlight, wandering stars, and fireflies. And again, this is just another one of those planes where I think this overly complicates things. There's not even really that much difference between the layers, and there's so much information about the outer planes to be asking players to remember already that if it was me, I would just run this as just one simple infinite layer called the Beastlands as this particular outer plane. As far as different ways to use this wonderful place, well, there's lots of hooks that you could do with the various magical creatures that are found here. There's lots of really powerful entities, whether they be much more powerful forms of things that you are familiar with, such as a celestial version of a rhinoceros or something like that, or just really powerful entities like a unicorn or something like that, some sort of celestial magical creature. And having a search for a specific beast can certainly be a way to hook your party in to coming to the Beastlands. The fact that in some situations, animal companions that pass away come here is also interesting. If this has happened in the past in your party and you've had a valued animal companion of the ranger or something like that that has been killed or slain in battle, coming here to visit it, or coming to visit a particular animal companion of perhaps an NPC who you're trying to get some information from, whenever the NPC itself is not being cooperative, trying to come to the Beastlands to track down this particular entity could be another interesting way to get your players here. I also really like the optional rules that the Dungeon Master's Guide has for the Beastlands. You can find it on page 60 in the D&D 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. But there's 2 optional rules that it lists for this plane. One is called Hunter's Paradise, and this just states that those who visit the Beastlands find their hunting and stalking capabilities improved, getting advantage on animal handling, perception, and survival checks while they're there. And this plays into the hunting aspect, to the aspect of trying to track down a specific creature. And of course, while I mentioned already about actually trying to find a specific beast, you could be tasked as a party to actually slay a specific beast as well. Maybe there's an evil beast that has infiltrated the beautiful wilderness of the Beastlands, and they've got to track it down. The other optional rule is called Beast Transformation, and this essentially states that whenever somebody who's visiting the plane slays an animal that is native to the Beastlands, they've got to make a DC 10 Charisma saving throw or become transformed into the type of beast that was slain, like with the polymorph spell. You still retain your intelligence and your ability to speak, but you're just stuck there as the creature that you slew. You can repeat this saving throw at the end of each long rest, but if you fail 3 times, the transformation can't be changed unless by remove curse or some other similar magic effect. This can be a really interesting thing that can be almost like a trick that maybe somebody who sent the party on a mission can play on the party. Perhaps they are trying to get them to slay a specific beast, which is not a bad beast, and they're just trying to trick them into doing it. And in so doing, now all of a sudden members of the party are turned into that specific beast, and now the party has to deal with the ramifications of being in the wild with lots of dangerous creatures while they're polymorphed into animals. And that could be a really interesting session. But that's the main ways that I think of when I think about using the Beastlands. I mean, it is literally called the Beastlands, and just that connection with animals and nature can play into some really interesting spaces. And you could tell some interesting stories related to conservation and taking care of the environment, where perhaps you're even in a situation where specific animals are going extinct on the prime material and you're trying to go find more of them on the Beastlands. There's lots of different nature-based and animal-based hooks that you can use regarding this specific outer plane. The final plane that we're going to discuss today is called the Olympian Glades of Arborea. And there are some minor similarities between the Beastlands and Arborea because they're adjacent outer planes. Arborea is aligned, as we said, with chaotic good, where the Beastlands is on the border between chaotic good and neutral good. But they're more different than you might think. Arborea does have a lot of nature elements as well, and as its name implies, this includes a lot of forest elements, such as large trees and beautiful orchards. But it's also got fields full of flowers and towering mountains as well. But everything is beautiful, embodying both loveliness and wilderness. But in reality, that's not what sets the plane apart. The distinctive feature of this plane is its intensity. It is full of extreme passion. The inhabitants are good, but emotional. They're dedicated to fighting all evil, but they're reckless at times. There's just such an intensity about the place. Rage and joy are both equally experienced and honored. There's happiness and sorrow experienced in fullness. This plane is home to much of the elven pantheon, primarily Corellan, and many elves and fae can be found here. There's often the sound of music in the air in the distance, and sometimes it's just the wind blowing through the large trees, but sometimes it is these individuals in celebration. And in addition to these elves, Eladrin and others, many spirits of elven dead find their ultimate rest here. Feasts, hunts, challenges, all the features of an ideal elven life are found here on Arborea. But again, it's a place just full of intensity, of passion. Everything is done to the full. There are 3 layers to this plane as well, though again, I find it unnecessary. The top layer is called Arvandor, and it's exactly the plane we've been talking about, this plane of a lot of forest elements and trees and orchards and the elves and such like that. But the second layer, Aqualar, is completely different. It's an eternal sea. And here dwells Deep Shashalas, the deity of the sea elves. And this particular place is the ending spot of the river Oceanus, which is a celestial river, kind of the equivalent of the river Styx, which flows metaphysically through the lower planes. The river Oceanus flows through some of the upper planes as well, and this is where it's supposedly supposed to end, here in this second layer of Arborea. The third and final layer is called Mithardir, which is a great desert of white, chalk-like dust. It was once a great forest as well, apparently, home to a lost race of titans and giants. But no one knows what happened here, because it's now a dangerous place that will take your life, and winds that will then grind your bones and add them to the powder of the plain. Some still come to this layer seeking to find remnants of this civilization, but generally this place is uninhabited and barren now. The only still inhabited area that I could find is a Forgotten Realms specific tidbit mostly, where the deity of the Mehorindid people lives, Nephthys. And again, I don't see why all of this can't be one place, where you have most of the plain being this forest paradise and this beautiful elven area within this area where the river Oceanus comes into and creates a massive sea, and then there's this one spot of it in this infinite layer where there's this massive desert where some long-lost civilization is destroyed. I don't see why this can't be just one layer, and that's how I would play it if it was my particular game, but in older editions it does have these 3 layers. As far as ways to use Arborea, a lot of it connects with the elves. If you have a player who wants to be an Eladrin, I would allow an Eladrin to be from here, not just from the Feywild. It's such a mystical, celestial, elven space. And I think that could be a unique backstory to tell an Eladrin story that isn't just related to the Fae. You have some of the same archetypes that you had with the Beastlands as far as going to actually try to find a specific creature. Well, you could be going to find a specific elf, maybe a lost individual who passed away that you're trying to seek information from, or maybe just a specific elven society that's developed some sort of technology or magic that you're trying to obtain for your party. The way the realms of the various elven deities here are described is really cool as well. Corellan's court is beautiful and amazing and very classically elven. A lot of the areas of elven civilization are described in manners which resemble Lothlorien in the ways that they interact with the massive trees of Arborea. Deep Shashalis in his domain in the second layer, his realm is described as a construct of coral, gold, and marble, veined with streaks of blue and green. The water around it is crystal blue, and it glows of its own volition. And the deity grants the ability to breathe water to those who find their way into the blue waters of his realm. So there's some really cool deific environments here on this particular plane. There's also a fountain, which is said to move locations, called the Fountain of Beauty, or Evergold, by the elves. It's just this pool of perfectly clear blue water surrounded by beautiful soft golden sand, and it's so still and so pure that light reflects off of it so well that it just hurts your eyes to look at it. And if you bathe in this particular fountain, it's said that your charisma increases. This particular information is from version 3.5, but mechanically back then it would increase your charisma by 1d4 plus 1 for a month and a day. And you could translate that to 5th edition however you will. But that is an interesting thing for your party to be trying to find. There's also this idea of this lost society of titans, which, honestly, you can do whatever you want with because there's not hardly anything written about it. It is lost, and there's nothing there that is described specifically. You can create whatever you want to have been there in this powdery, chalky desert or whatever it was before, and generate a really cool dungeon and exploration mission in order for the party to obtain some information or get a magic item or what have you. So those are some ways you can use Arborea in the Beastlands. And that just about wraps up our series. Which one of the Outer Planes is your favorite? How have you used them in your particular stories? Give us a shout on social media and let us know. But I guess for now it's about time for us to leave the Beastlands and Arborea and head over to the wilds. We're out here in the wilderness, and we didn't have to go far because, well, we're looking at a celestial creature native to the upper plains. We're looking at the hollyphant, and they are absolutely amazing. They're one of my favorite Dungeons & Dragons creatures. They look like cute little golden Dumbos. They're small elephant-like creatures that are covered in golden fur. They've got pearlescent trunks and small wings which beat really fast that they can use to fly very far. They've got a speed of 120 feet in the air, actually. And they are celestial creatures. They're used by angels and good deities as messengers and helpers. They're quite smart with an intelligence of 16, and they can speak celestial as well as communicate telepathically with anything within 120 feet. They're very kind, benevolent creatures, gentle, but they are purely lawful good, and they will not stand for evil. And if a hollyphant sees an evil act, it will not hesitate to punish the evildoer. And they are just really interesting to throw into a story. They're visually extremely interesting creatures. They are small, even though they're this elephant-like creature. They are quite literally the small class, and having the party receive a message from perhaps the deity that the cleric or the paladin worships, or just from some other entity, is just fascinating. Just that this entity can just show up Skyrim courier style in front of you, this little golden elephant, and just communicate a message is just really fascinating and visually cool, very memorable. It's one of those little things that you can throw in, and even if they don't do anything with it, and it's a 5-minute interaction, they are going to remember that most of all out of that session. For certain creatures, they can also be used as mounts, and part of that is because they can actually polymorph into a larger mammoth-like form, and we'll go over that when we go over their stat block in a little bit. But actually, Zariel, who's an archdevil, she's the lord over the first layer of the 9 hells, Avernus, she used one named Lulu as a mount while she was still an angel. These entities are also prime candidates for certain effects like the spell Planar Ally, or perhaps the fulfillment of a divine intervention request. Just any way that you can work these creatures into a story, they're just so fascinating and so memorable to tell stories with. And if you can't find another reason, but you end up on a place like the Beastlands or Arborea, I would just throw one of these things into the environment, just to be able to have this interaction with the party. They're just so fascinating. But for all this being said, they're also interesting foes as well, and this is part of what makes them my favorite, because while most of the time they're going to be on your side, but what happens if it thinks you're doing something wrong? Perhaps it thinks that the party is not supposed to be in an area, and it lashes out in defense of what it thinks is right. And if it does, you are down to combat with one of the most interesting stat blocks that exists in 5th edition. They're a challenge rating 5, but only 36 hit points and an armor class of 18, so you know there has to be special stuff going on here. As we mentioned, they have a fly speed of 120 feet and a walking speed of just 20, a strength score of 10, dex of 11, con of 12, intelligence of 16, charisma of 16, and wisdom of 19 as their highest skill. They've got the typical resistances to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, immunities to poison and the poison condition, and passive perception of 14. But where it really gets interesting is when you start reading their features. They have something called the Aura of Invulnerability, which states that an invisible aura forms a 10-foot radius sphere around the hollyphant for as long as it lives. Any spell of 5th level or lower cast from outside the barrier can't affect creatures or objects within it, even if the spell is cast using a higher level spell slot. So for instance, you can not cast a 4th level spell at 6th level, it's still not going to have any effect. You have to cast a spell which is naturally 6th level or higher, otherwise it doesn't affect anything in the sphere. The feature continues. Such a spell can target creatures and objects within the barrier, but even though it can target it, it can't have any effect on them. Similarly, the area within the barrier is excluded from areas affected by such spells. The hollyphant can use an action to suppress this trait, if it wants, until its concentration ends, as if concentrating on a spell. So this little creature, this little flying golden Dumbo, just has an invulnerable sphere around it, which makes it completely unaffected by any spells that are lower than 6th level. And not just itself, anything within that sphere is unaffected. So if you can get within that sphere, if you perhaps are an ally of a hollyphant, then if you get within that sphere, then whatever attacks you is not going to affect you. And that's a fascinating little interaction. The hollyphant does have innate spell casting. It can cast the spell Light at will, and twice a day it can do things like Bless, Cure Wounds, Protection from Evil and Good. But once a day, it's got a lot of powerful options. It can cast Teleport with no chance of error. It can cast Banishment, Heal, Raise Dead, and it can have that ability to shape change, which can only shape change it into one thing, but it's an awesome thing. It can make it into a golden furred mammoth with feathered wings and a fly speed that's still 120 feet. Imagine this little golden Dumbo just morphing and transforming into a massive full-grown golden furred mammoth and flying around at 120 feet around. That is amazing. As far as actions are concerned, it does have a tusk attack, and its attacks are considered magical. But its most interesting action is its trumpet ability, which it can do 3 times a day, which creates a trumpet sound as it blows air through its trunk that can be heard out to 600 feet away. Whenever this happens, there's a 30-foot cone of energy that exudes out from the trumpet that can have one of 2 effects. One is the trumpet of blasting, where each creature in the cone has to make a DC 14 Constitution saving throw, and on a failed save, the creature takes 5d6 thunder damage and is deafened for a minute. And on a successful save, the creature takes half as much damage and isn't deafened. Non-magical objects in the cone that aren't being held or worn take 10d6 thunder damage. So it can just blast apart a wall if it wants. If it doesn't want to use its trumpet to do its blasting ability, it's got another ability called a Trumpet of Sparkles, where it just blows the air out of its trunk and makes the creatures in that 30-foot cone make a DC 14 Constitution saving throw or take radiant damage, 4d8 plus 4 to be exact, on a failed save, or half as much on a success. And evil creatures have disadvantage on the saving throw, and good creatures in the cone take no damage. So it can just blast straight into a whole mass of enemies and only hit the evil ones. This is just such an interesting stat block. It makes me want to find some way for a hollyphant to be corrupted so that it can fight the party, because it is such an interesting little creature. They really are one of my most favorite 5th edition monsters, and if you have a chance to throw one into a situation, I would definitely try doing so. But I think that's about all the time we have out here in the wilds. Why don't we head over to the tavern and get some refreshment? We've traveled a lot today. Alright, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if the gods were at war? Now, this is a classic trope, going back to all sorts of mythologies that have a pantheon of deities. This question of what would happen if a war began between rival gods. And this connects with the planar theme for this week's episode, because that's where the realms of the gods are in D&D cosmology. They're in the outer planes. So you have to ask yourself, if you want to use this hook, how is it going to affect the prime material and the locations where my players are? Because theoretically, this could happen entirely isolated from that prime plane. It's not like where all the gods in ancient Greece are warring on Mount Olympus and the people down below can see the fireworks, so to speak, and bolts of energy are coming down and destroying towns and cities. No, forces from Arborea and the Beastlands could be at war and you'd never know it. In fact, the constant cosmic war between the devils and the demons, called the Blood War, is already constantly raging canonically, and it doesn't always spill out into the prime material. But there are ways that it can spill out into a player's story if this is a hook that you want to use. One way is that the gods could be coming to the prime material, whether in an avatar form or just via inspired followers, to recruit more people to their cause. And this could be done in nefarious ways or just in legitimate ways where people are going around evangelizing, just genuinely trying to get people to help increase their God's power through prayer or by going to a specific place in order to aid them in their fight. This extraplanar war could also get involved if the followers of each of the warring factions began to war against each other in the prime material plane, where all of a sudden you have the followers of both gods now actually starting a real world war with each other, mirroring the wars that the gods are having in the outer planes. And perhaps this is even how the gods war. Maybe they don't want to destroy their homes and their realms as they're fighting each other, so they just egotistically use people as proxies for their squabbles. Another option is that the battle that's going on in the outer planes is having a negative effect on the prime material in some metaphysical way. The Spell Plague is an example of that, which was a D&D canonical event where Mystra, the goddess of magic, was killed by Cyric and Shar. And whenever that happened, the weave, which is like the magical membrane which goes through all of reality, was shaking and trembling, and that caused the Spell Plague. That event outside of the prime material had effects on the mortal world. Or it could be that the party could just be getting involved during a trip around the outer planes. They could be going to the outer planes like the Beastlands or Arborea for some other reason, and now all of a sudden they're just involved in a conflict because of proximity. But if you do want to have this as a hook in your particular story, we need to think about exactly how it's going to affect the real world, because it isn't actually connected inherently. Two gods fighting on Eastgard isn't necessarily going to have an effect on your local town. But there are certainly ways to do it, and it can make for a really interesting story. But I think that about wraps up this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you all very much for listening. Keep your eye out on our social media for continued updates around the launch of Plot Hooks Adventures and our quest for 1K followers on Twitter. Please check out our Patreon and give the podcast a rating. And again, just thanks for listening. From all of us here on the Plot Hooks team, I'm Samuel. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.